Always great to be here in Washington. I came from the NATO summit, which I look forward to, although I feel the joke is absolutely true. In Washington, even the monuments and the statues are more easygoing than politicians. The highlight of NatCon is exactly that. Besides politicians, I can meet brilliant thinkers too. A clear disadvantage of being a politician is that you are always rushing somewhere. There is never enough time to take a break and think about the important things in life. You are always required to take action. In Hungary, we have an expression, an English expression for that. What we are doing is not think tank, but more like a do tank activity. Being a politician has its advantages too. Just in the past 2 weeks or so, I'd had the chance to visit Brussels, Madrid, Paris, Kiev, among others. Yesterday, I arrived from Paris, where I met former French President Nicolas Sarkozy. He said France is chaotic, urged Europe to stop the war and focus on peace. Well, as a disclaimer, I do not only meet people who share my views. In Madrid, I went on a debate at the largest European globalist forum, the Soros-funded European Council of Foreign Relations, which was organized by Europe's biggest LGBTQ pride parade, also took place in Madrid. You can imagine how popular I was as a Hungarian being called Orbán. In a Q&A session, the very first question I received, followed by a huge applause, was, if Hungary doesn't agree with the EU mainstream, why Hungary doesn't leave the European Union at last? So as you can imagine, at the last, the tone of the conversation got better, well, as much as it could. But getting back to my point, sometimes being a politician can get difficult, but the advantage I enjoy the most is that you can get the opportunity to observe the changes in the world up close, and even if only on a very small scale, do something about it. This year, Yoram asked me to focus on national conservatism in my speech and talk about something I feel is important for the movement. So I decided to choose foreign policy and the shift in global narrative. Every era has its own narrative, an explanatory principle, the Weltanschauung, as the Germans say. There is a certain idea by which we explain everything in politics. From this idea, we interpret the events of the world and identify the means to achieve them. These, of course, change from time to time. Some say there is a logic behind the change of narratives, and history is moving in a certain direction. Others see this as a threat to free will. If there is a predefined direction for history, we are not free to do what we want. In the former Eastern Bloc, where I come from during the Cold War, the narrative was that we were marching towards the glorious world revolution of communists. It's a pretty bad memory. While part of the world was working on communist revolution in the Western world, anti-communism was a predominant narrative. They said that our most important duty was defeat communism. It was such a unifying goal that conservatives and liberals could join forces and unite behind the idea. Yoram also was writing a lot about this, actually. But in the 90s, as communism was defeated, or at least we were thought so, a new narrative was needed. While conservatives were scratching their heads, liberals came up with a new universal narrative based on neoliberalist principles. The prime example being Fukuyama's infamous book, The End of History and the Last Man. As the title suggests, this is a complete worldview, a form of globalization. It has a view on the philosophy of history. It has a specific theory of the state. It has a unique economic philosophy and a view on human nature, of course. The End of History suggests that with the victory of neoliberalism, history has come to an end. Non-Western countries of the world would adapt to the Western model of state and economic organization. The neoliberal man feels at home everywhere, bound by nothing. This person takes their skills and expertise to the global market, provides for themselves, and achieves goals, social status through their professional career. And neoliberalism was not only an ideology, it was a program to promote across the world. And if I wanted to sound modern, it was also #LifeGoal. Those believing in neoliberalism wanted to encourage more and more countries to adopt this worldview. There was an institutional system, and there is still an institutional system, including IMF, World Bank, others, aiming to promote this worldview to all countries. But then something happened. Things didn't work out the way they should have. Non-Western countries connected to the free trade channels without aligning their political and economic systems. They became stronger, but they became not Westernized. Moreover, they even dared to become more competitive and more resilient to crisis than many of their Western counterparts. As a result, people had to admit themselves, history has not ended. And the liberal response, just as in the 1990s, ahead of the conservatives, liberals managed to quickly come up with a substitute ideology. A prime example of this is, I think, the Ukrainian-Russian conflict. The question I have always been really interested in, why did Western powers react differently in 2022 than in 2014? The same countries are involved. The moral responsibility is the same territories are affected. Everything is the same in that conflict. But the reaction is completely different. In 2014, Western powers isolated the conflict. They tried to keep the status quo and kept Russia integrated in the Western system. In 2022, bloc formation started, Western military support to Ukraine and direct confrontation were encouraged. They tried and still try to push Russia completely from the Western political, monetary, energy sector, its institutions. So I was really puzzled why this change in the strategy happened. My argument is that it's because of the shift in the narrative. In 2014, the old narrative was in place. 2022, new narrative took precedence. And what is the new narrative? I would summarize it briefly as a struggle of arbitrarily defined democracies against autocracies, or put it in another way, the narrative of bloc formation. Trust me, I'm not obsessed with Fukuyama, but I have to mention him again for the sake of my argument, because he is a kind of a poster child for this ideology. Fukuyama published an article in The Atlantic in the fall of 2022 titled, "More Proof that this really is the end of history." In it, he claims, among other things, that liberal democracies are on the verge of victory against so-called autocracies. Not a specific country, or not just a specific country, but anyone who doesn't submit to the mainstream liberal views. According to him, humankind's fate will be decided in the coming decades, and liberal democracies need one last big effort. Or as he puts, I quote, "Liberal democracy will not make a comeback unless people are willing to struggle on its behalf," end quote. This narrative has become so dominant that it is now actually part of the official foreign policy doctrine of all progressive governments. As the ultimate liberal ideologue, George Soros, another famous Hungarian, said, quote, "The world has been increasingly engaged over the past half decade in a struggle between open society and closed society," end quote. Let me add a personal, unique Hungarian comment on this. We Hungarians are really familiar with these slogans. Not so long ago, Hungarian students had to sing the Communist International in schools, which literally says, "This is a final struggle. Let us get there tomorrow." What a surprise, what a surprise. The old communists viewed history much like today's liberals do, as a secular eschatology, complete with dogmas, priests, and not least, heretics. The dogmas were laid out of the text like the Manifesto of the Communist Party or End of History and The Last Man. The priests were the Marxist ideologists then and the leading liberal scholars and authors now. And who are the heretics? Anyone who thinks independently, especially us, National Conservatives. The liberal institutional system has long prepared the ground for the final struggle narrative. Let me give you a few more examples. You probably know the organization Freedom House. One of the biggest supporters is George Soros. After the 1990s, the organization tried to encourage countries to implement neoliberal reforms in the name of democracy through its ranking system. Back then, it was a prestige for countries to move up on the list. Today, the opposite is happening. The organization uses its lists as a weapon now, identifying the enemies of open society. Those countries perform better who sign up for neoliberal principles, and those who refuse to take part in this are ranked purely. This list basically serves as a tool to define who are the good and who are the bad democracies or countries. As another example, 15, even 10 years ago, liberal theorists were writing books about how connecting the world, so-called connectivity, is a good thing. They said it brings peace and prosperity and lifts millions out of poverty. That's why we need to increase connectivity, making the world a better place, which is completely in line with Fukuyama end of history theory back at that time. But today, the exact same people are writing books about how global connectivity is dangerous and that the West should separate itself as much as possible from the non-Western part of the world, just as said by Fukuyama 2.0. You don't need to be a great analyst today to see that the world is changing. We Hungarians have been saying this since the financial crisis. The real novelty is that by 2024, it has become clear that the liberals' narrative is about this new era we are entering. This is the narrative of bloc formation, decoupling, confrontation between different ideologies. The narrative of struggle between countries that identify as democracies and autocracies. This explains why liberals choose to support the war in 2022 instead of promoting peace, because every event, every goal setting, and the selection of means comes from the narrative of democracies and autocracies and serving the idea of bloc formation. Today, the narrative of this bloc formation logic has become a grand strategy. The essence of this grand strategy is that if the Western world cannot westernize the rest of the world with kind words, it will do through conflict. Just as Rousseau said, for the sake of enlightenment and freeing mankind, I quote, "This means nothing less than that he will be forced to be free," end quote. So we National Conservatives must recognize that liberals has a specific political goal with their narrative. Since they failed to organize the world according to their neoliberal Western model, they are using this narrative to maintain their hegemony in the Western world at the expense of National Conservatives. We, as National Conservatives, I think we cannot accept the liberal narrative of this grand strategy and bloc formation. We cannot forget that many of the problems we see in the world today were caused by liberal narrative that has been in place since 1990s. Regardless of the new ideology being the opposite of the previous one, it is unwise to accept the narrative created by those whose previous one already failed. Bloc formation, decoupling, ideological-driven conflicts are policies that are already proving not to serve the interests of Western world. Technological, economic differences between the West, rest disappeared in terms of resources, population growth. The rest is having at least same numbers, but sometimes better numbers. Only military strength remains an advantage for the West, but this only increases the likelihood of conflict. If we form blocks and close the doors on ourselves, we will only cut ourselves off from and alienate ourselves from the faster growing part of the world. In the end, we will fall behind and our rivals will overtake us. This mechanism can already be observed today, particularly in Europe and Hungary. The new liberal narrative is dominating the discourse in Europe. We are good, we are democracies. Russia is bad, they are autocracies. Therefore, we can't communicate with them. We try, and we have the duty to destroy them, and we sacrifice everything for that is needed. Our economy, energy supply chain, middle class, and what happened now, Europe is decoupling from Russia. The war didn't stop. The risk of escalation is actually higher than ever before. The European economy is struggling big time. The policy is proven to be a failure by encouraging Europe to cut ties with others and risking the competitiveness. What does the United States of America do? They protect their own industry through the IRA and try to convince companies to move their production capacities from Europe to US. According to IMF forecast, why United States, and I'm not saying positive things on the Biden administration anymore, but according to IMF forecast, why the United States will achieve an average annual growth 3%, China 5%, India 7% in coming years, Europe will be lucky to achieve 1% growth. I know I shouldn't only talking about Hungary, but the doctrine of bloc formation goes against Hungarian national conservative traditions as well. Through our history, Hungary was always fought for independence and was defined itself as a mediator between different parts of the world. Hungary was able to succeed when it was both independent and able to fulfill this chosen role as a mediator. Bloc formations means losing our independence because we would be pushed to the periphery of Western civilization. Bloc formation would require us to cut off connections with and abandon countries that do not meet the so-called liberal democratic standards. And I think the liberal narrative, and this is the risky part of my speech, but I think that the liberal narrative also puts American national conservatives into a very difficult position. Because you are in a tough spot, because from an American perspective, there is a partial truth in the liberal doctrine. The partial truth is that China is indeed grown stronger, and the United States indeed needs to compete with the stronger China. Most probably it is also true that you should be less dependent towards China than today. We don't know how this rivalry looks like, but it seems that competition is inevitable. I really hope that confrontation is, but we will see. China has a different political system than ours in the West. This compels American national conservatives to accept the liberal narrative and divide the world into democracies and autocracies. But I think this is an ultimate mistake that we mustn't do. National conservatives have their own world view, their own explanation, and their own distinct values. The liberal narrative of bloc formation undermines the independence of individual nations. This narrative is fundamentally globalist and imperialist, claiming that liberal elites have the right to decide the policies of individual nations. This logic is bad for the United States as well, because it alienates potential allies and necessary parties in the global competition. Bloc formation undermines the ability of national governments to seek the advancement of their own countries in line with the wishes of their voters. Meanwhile, the liberal elites promoting bloc formation are not democratically accountable. Bloc formation also undermines the principle of free enterprise because it subordinates the establishment of economic relationships to political considerations. Bloc formation builds a world that national conservatives want to avoid. If national conservatives accept this narrative and even help it to succeed, then liberals would turn against National Conservative, just as they did after the 1990s. Therefore, I suggest a different path. We must engage in a debate by creating our own narrative and interpretation of the word. We need to provide different lens through which we can see the word. I see the upcoming era as the age of sovereignty, a return to Westphalian principles, where every nation has the right to define its goals and choose its path. In this era, foreign policy is made by sovereign actors rather than dictated to everyone by superpowers. In the age of sovereignty, differences in worldviews and strategic approaches is not a bug, but a feature. It is inevitable that multiple centers of power will emerge, and while they may compete with each other, they are not expansionist and do not seek to destroy one another. Well-constructed interstate relations provide an opportunity for dialogue. Such a system ensures a stable world order and guarantees that armed conflicts remains the last resort. Many criticize my prime minister for his peace mission, for meeting President Zelensky, Putin, and Xi all within the week right before coming to the NATO summit here in DC. But all he did was recognize that wars lead nowhere. Modern conflicts do not have military solutions. They require hard-won diplomatic resolutions. This is what the age of sovereignty looks like in practice. The word is a complex phrase, different interests, values, and historical experiences. This is what we NatCons should be able to describe by coming up with an intellectually sound narrative. At the beginning, I spoke about how politicians have the chance to witness firsthand the changes in our world and our own small ways take action. But I believe it's not just politicians, it's all of us gathered here today. The coming years will be key in a battle of narratives, and as national conservatives, we must actively engage in shaping them. I wish each of us success on this journey. We Hungarians are trying to do our best. Thank you very much for the attention.